All right, here we go. I've got one story. It's kind of a long story, and it is a non-encounter story. But if I ran into what this man ran into in the woods, knowing where he was and how he got there, it would have scared me to death. And I would have gotten out of there real quick. So listen up to this story and tell me if you don't think this isn't scary. He titles the story Just Evidence. I have a story to tell of a Bigfoot non-encounter, more like a sensory evidence event than anything else. It is both unusual and entertaining in that it took place before I knew of the reality of Bigfoot. There I was in the woods confronted with the evidence of that exact reality and was utterly unable to process it. It was the summer of 1975 in the northeastern United States. I was hiking the Northville Lake Placid Trail in New York's Adirondacks State Park. Just for scale, I'll tell you that the Adirondacks State Park is a bit larger than the entire state of New Jersey where I was living then. I was hiking alone for a few days, letting my pioneer spirit have its way. I was on my first day. I was in good physical shape and the miles melted under me. The hike was fantastic and the trail was in very good repair. I felt as though I was bounding along. Nature was all around me and thankfully the black flies had not yet appeared. As long as I kept moving, the sweat I produced evaporated nicely with the occasional forest breeze. So far, I had met no one. My pack didn't feel too heavy and I was really enjoying myself. I had arrived on the trail around 1 p.m. after the drive up from New Jersey, and I walked the afternoon until near dusk, and then I set up camp. I didn't build a fire, so I was able to watch and see the forest around me without the glare of the fire's bright wall holding back the night. No need for a tent fly. The weather was perfect. The stars were everywhere. So far, what a trip. Later, to evade some persistent mosquitoes, I went into the tent and zipped the mesh shut. I settled on top of the sleeping bag, and I took out my map and pen light for a once-over of tomorrow's trek. Reading the contour lines, I saw that there were some interesting-looking spaces along the way, a little over 3 miles off the trail. I really don't know the reason I chose to go there. It just looked interesting, that's all. Looking back, I like to feel that I was drawn there for some reason. I don't know, I loved orienteering, and I just needed somewhere to go. Perhaps, subconsciously, I hoped I would find something. Later, after I cooked my supper on a white gas stove inside the vestibule of the tent, I removed my compass from its leather case, and I began to develop bearings away from the trail for the next day's hike. When I'm alone, I like to do things to break up the monotony, and for tomorrow this would be it. I settled back into a happy sleep and awaited the dawn, anticipating the map adventure to come. I awoke alert and rested, and I felt as though I had been sleeping on a cloud. It was more of a recollection of a night than a feeling, if you can imagine that. It's something you strive to get again. Usually there's a noisy dawn chorus of birds to start the day, but all I heard that morning were crows. I ate a fast breakfast of coffee, cold hard-boiled egg, washed up, packed up, and I was eager to get on the bushwhack, as we called it back then, when one leaves the trail and goes off into the woods, fading into the tree line. I hiked on down to a stream which showed up on the map as crossing the trail, and I filled up my gray water bottle for boiling later. I had enough water for the trip off trail and back. I turned right, walked a few steps, turned around, and took a back bearing on the trail, using it as my baseline for the return. I had everything well mapped out on paper, but there's nothing like being really sure of things when you're alone. So I ducked my head and left the trail, taking a bearing on a large oak, and I started walking towards it. That's what you do when you're hiking off trail. You go via object bearing, object bearing, object bearing until you can see further. Then it's still the same, only the object, such as a tree, a large rock, or some other feature on the landscape stands out. The course wasn't exactly a straight line. I had planned it that way to add a little more of a challenge to it, so I had to pace off a few out-of-view objects until I was back in line and back on course to the terminus of my bushwhack. I was playing soldier, and I was really enjoying myself. After I left the trail, I started hearing the birds again, also scurrying squirrels who hated the stranger that was in their world now. When you're off trail, you can tell a whole lot better what kind of woods you're in. The briars and berry bushes get culled from the trail during routine trail maintenance. Sometimes that sort of gives the trail a generic park kind of look. I don't like that, but the walking is easier, I guess. We humans like to make parks, but parks in the woods seem out of place. The trees were fairly dense and vines were about, and the leaf litter was pretty noisy as I walked. There were humid areas in some of the darker, more sheltered gullies, but as long as I moved along, it wasn't too much of a discomfort. I stopped often to admire and investigate the flora and the fauna along the way. There were flowers, there were vultures up high, birds, bugs, and rodents, and they all were worth a look. By now, I was about an hour and a half into the trip and was a bit tired from all the stooping I had been doing with the now heavy pack. I'm 6'6", and in some places I had a lot of bending to do. I needed a drink and took off my pack to sit down. I was a little more winded than I thought I was and wasn't really paying attention too much. I just wanted a little rest and a drink of cool water. I flopped down on a high rock and exhaled in relief. I raised my water bottle to drink, and as the cool, clean water went down my parched throat, I saw a dark shape up in the air just a little off to my right. Gradually, as I began to get rested and gather my humidified wits about me again, I could see that I was just on the edge of and a little above what could be described as a clearing in the loosest of terms. Actually, it looked like someone had tried to build a fort or something, but they just couldn't get it right. There were tree trunks which looked like they were deliberately placed but not in the right way to make them into something definite. Wait a minute. I was looking off to the left now and was really a bit amazed at the same time and disturbed by what I saw. There was a tree about 1.5 feet or so across, which had its bark scraped off. I think it was an oak, but it could have been something else. I was looking at the scraped part. It was lighter than the rest of the tree, which went from about 4 feet off the ground to about a foot past where I could reach, making it 10 or 11 feet up. No problem, except there were claw marks on it, 4 claws together, at nearly right angles to the trunk, all the way up. I was astounded when I saw that. My hackles immediately went up, as I thought it may have been a grizzly or a large brown bear. I started looking around in real earnest. It had gotten very, very quiet. Those claw marks were at least, I would say, a minimum of 1/4 inch wide, sometimes a little more, into the wood. The tree was green. It was not rotted in the least. I couldn't make those marks easily with a saw and an axe if I had to. What was I looking at? What made those marks? I never found out. Today I would have taken pictures with my cell phone, but back then we didn't have cell phones. I've never seen anything like that again, and I had never seen it before that. At that point, I needed to look at this thing closer. I had successfully gotten my jaw back into place from looking at the tree trunk when it fell open again, this time by virtue of what I saw up in the crotch of a tree. There, again, 10 or 11 feet up in the air, was a very big, heavy tree stump, dirt and all. That thing weighed 300 pounds if it weighed an ounce. I had done some logging as a teenager, and I knew my wood weights. They could kill you if you misjudged them. You can rely on it that I got the stump's weight right. It was a big one. I looked for more stumps in the air, but there were none. By now, you can imagine how I was feeling. Not quite flight or fight yet, but approaching something close to it. None of the large, close to 1 foot or more diameter logs, which were stuck up in trees or crisscross standing on the ground, had been sawn. They had been broken off and placed there. I couldn't find the sockets that they belonged in either. Back when I was logging, if we were to have done such a thing, it would have taken a log skidder and many feet of cable and chain to get the logs up there. I took my time, I walked about the area, and I looked for signs. I really had no idea what to look for, and I poked and I searched and I sniffed the air, and I did all the kemosabe stuff and came up just as clueless as when I started. I kept telling myself that there has to be something, but I never found it. The crime scene was clean. The bodies were there, but there was no sign of a weapon. It looked like the perpetrator got away. Remember, this was 1975, and there was no internet. There were no cell phones, no way to snap a picture. I had no idea what I was observing. I just knew it was darned odd. So I sat down on that rock and surmised and contemplated and I guessed and formulated and worried at what I was seeing. At that time in those years, everything was supposed to have a logical, scientific explanation, so I sat down to make one. And my theory was that it was a micro-tornado. Yeah, that was the ticket. But wait, there was too much mass thrown about in too little of an area with too little damage to the surrounding trees, so it couldn't be that. After sitting there and pondering and wondering for most of the afternoon, I had to return to the trail and I needed to get going. I burned my brain for days after trying to come up with something to explain it, but I couldn't. Everyone I explained it to couldn't grasp the scale of the scene, so no new offerings or explanations arose. Today, I would almost immediately say it was definitely a Bigfoot. Time is a funny thing. I hope your audience can understand the land of Oz I found myself in so suddenly on that day. Even back then, it was obvious that something big had happened there, and whatever did it could just as easily do it again. And no, I definitely do not have an explanation for the scratches either. Over the years, I have noticed that possibly the only thing that could have made the marks like that was a giant tree sloth. But why? I'd like to apologize and say that I cannot give this story a more cogent ending like seeing a Bigfoot, but I like to think that maybe he or she was there somewhere watching and laughing at me the whole time. That could have been the case. You know, I don't know what to say about this story, but I had a visual in my head as I was reading this. I've read through it like 3 times, and it's kind of like I've seen pictures of these trees that have been uprooted, like they're snapped off 15 feet up. They're uprooted and then turned upside down and shoved in the ground. Every time I see an image like that, man, it's almost as scary to me as seeing a Bigfoot. And I think this is probably what this man saw. And this was only 7 or 8 years after the Patterson-Gimlin event. Of course, it's on the total other side of the country. That was in the west, and this is happening in the northeast. But still, apparently, we know now that these things are living all over the United States, even in places that we would least expect them to be. And in 1975, this man walked up on a huge log structure that was obviously done by no animal that's in the woods today. So what do you guys think? You think it was Bigfoot? Do you think that stuff could just happen naturally? I thought it was a great story and worth sharing with you. So I want to say thank you to the writer. I certainly do appreciate it. And hope you guys enjoyed the video, and we'll see you guys next time. Thanks.